For 7 months, I gave Joel and his wife Tamara a home, free rent, shared utilities, a full refrigerator, and more goodwill than I had any legal or moral obligation to provide, while the permits for their new build outside of Guelph crawled through the municipal backlog with no end in sight. Then, on a Thursday morning in early November, Tamara walked into my personal study and told me she needed the room cleared out by the following Friday so her sister could stay there. Her sister Bridget was relocating from Calgary, a work secondment. 2 months, possibly 3. Bridget and her husband Craig would need a place to stay. In my house. In the room where I kept 30 years of financial ledgers, my mother's letters, and the oak writing desk that my late husband Ken had restored for me the winter before he died. I did not react immediately. I had spent 31 years as a bookkeeper at Wellington County, and I had learned that the first thing you do when someone presents you with a number that doesn't add up is pause. You do not react. You verify. I heard you, I said. I'll need to think about that. Tamara looked mildly surprised. I think she had expected either a quick yes or a flustered excuse she could talk around. She nodded, poured herself a coffee from my percolator without offering me one, and walked back to the dining room table she had converted into her remote workspace 3 months earlier. My name is Lorena. I am 64 years old. I have owned this house on Pemberton Crescent for 22 years. Ken and I bought it when Joel was still in primary school, painted the upstairs hallway together over a long Victoria Day weekend. Ken on the ladder, doing the trim, me rolling the walls in a shade called antique linen that I had deliberated over for 2 weeks. Ken had a stroke 6 years ago and did not survive it. The house has been mine, legally and entirely, ever since. When Joel called me last March and asked whether he and Tamara could stay while the builder sorted out the permit delays, I said yes before he'd finished the sentence. He was my son. The spare room was sitting empty. I told him it would be good to have the house feel lived in again. I had no idea what I was actually agreeing to. The early weeks were manageable. Tamara was surface-level polite, thanking me fiq Rasul, keeping the bathroom tidy, making occasional conversation over breakfast. But underneath that politeness was a constant, quiet assumption that she had the right to improve whatever space she occupied. By the end of the first month, my kitchen cabinets had been reorganized. My baking supplies were on the top shelf behind Tamara's collection of protein powders and specialty flours. My good stock pot had been moved to a lower cupboard because she felt it looked cluttered on the stove. I said something about it. I stood in my own kitchen and told Tamara, in the friendliest tone I could manage, that I preferred my things where I had placed them. She listened, said she completely understood, and then changed the subject. Nothing moved back. I mentioned it to Joel that evening. He shifted uncomfortably and said Tamara was just trying to help. He'd talk to her. He either didn't or it produced no result I could detect. The protein powders stayed where she'd put them. I told myself it was minor. I was not wrong about that, but I let it go, and letting things go turned out to have a cost. By September, Tamara had taken over the formal living room. Her marketing consultancy had grown busy, she explained, and the dining room table was too cramped for video calls with clients. The living room had better light and a more professional background. My reading chair, a tall wingback that Ken had reupholstered one anniversary and presented to me with a bow he'd tied himself, ended up shoved against the back hallway wall to make room for her ring light and her laptop stand. I tried again. I sat down with Joel and told him directly that I didn't mind Tamara using the dining room, but the living room was where I spent my evenings and I wanted it back. Joel nodded seriously, said I was and said he'd handle it. What he actually said to Tamara was that I was feeling a little territorial. She told me this 3 days later as though it explained and concluded the entire matter. I understood then that arguing would accomplish nothing further. Tamara had decided, somewhere early in this arrangement, that my preferences were optional and hers were requirements. Joel had decided, somewhere even earlier, that avoiding conflict with his wife was easier than maintaining a clear position on anything. I had been hoping that would change. I was still hoping it might. On the Thursday morning, she walked into my study. My study was the one room I had held back entirely. I had not offered it, not even when I first saw Tamara measuring it with her eyes the week they moved in. It was where I kept my mother's recipe journals and her letters going back to 1974. My own diaries from my 20s onward, the orderly ledgers from every year of my career, and the oak desk that Ken's had spent an entire winter restoring, stripping it back, filling the gouges, refinishing it in a warm walnut stain, after I had admired a similar one in a catalog and quietly decided it was too expensive. It was the most personal room in my house by a considerable distance. Tamara wanted me to clear it by Friday and bring in a guest bed. When I said I needed to think, I meant it in the most literal sense. I went and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes, something I have done since my 40s when I need to work through a problem without an audience. The situation had moved through a predictable progression: kitchen, dining room, living room, and now the study. There was nowhere further to go after this. I was not going to open that door. That evening, Joel found me in the back garden, deadheading the last of the mums before the frost came in. He sat on the wooden step and did what he always did, framed the whole thing as a logistics problem. Bridget had bought her train ticket. The rental market in Guelph was brutal right now. It would only be 2 months. Could I not use the guest room for my personal things in the meantime? I asked him where Bridget was when Tamara reorganized my kitchen. He didn't answer. I asked him where Bridget was when my chair got pushed into the hallway. He looked at his shoes. "Joel," I said, pulling a dead bloom off the stem, "I have said something every time Tamara has pushed past a boundary in this house. Each time, nothing changed. I am not going to continue saying things that produce no result. This time I am going to act." He had the same expression he wore at 11 when he realized I was genuinely serious and could not be redirected. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means give me a few days and understand that my answer about the study is no." He went inside. I finished the garden. Friday morning, I drove to my branch of RBC on Stone Road. I had been meaning to separate the household finances for weeks, kept putting it off out of some softness I could no longer afford. That morning, I opened a personal checking account in my name only, transferred my pension deposits and personal savings, and canceled the supplemental debit card I'd added to Joel's wallet months ago for grocery runs. The teller was efficient and professional, and I was done in under 40 minutes. I stopped at Tim Hortons on the way home and sat with a medium dark roast, looking out at the November parking lot. I did not feel particularly angry. I felt clear-headed in a way I hadn't been in months, which told me I was making the right decision. That afternoon, I called my friend Susan, who had worked for 20 years as a paralegal at a firm on Wyndham Street before retiring. I explained everything. Susan confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Because Joel and Tamara had been living in my home for over 7 months without a written lease or formal rental agreement, the situation was more legally complicated than most people realized. Under Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act, there was a reasonable argument that they had acquired some tenant protections. The appropriate step was a proper written notice, 60 days given the length of occupancy, delivered clearly and documented. I thanked her and asked if she'd help me draft it. She said she'd come over Saturday morning and we'd do it over tea. Saturday, Susan and I sat at the kitchen table while Tamara was out and drafted a formal, respectful notice to vacate. It specified that Joel and Tamara were required to arrange alternative housing within 60 days. Susan made sure the language was proper for Ontario. I signed 2 copies and put them in a folder on my desk. That same afternoon, I called a locksmith I'd seen on the community board at the library, Pete, who ran a small security and hardware business out of a unit on Speedvale Avenue. I explained that I needed a solid keyed deadbolt installed on my interior study door. Pete came Sunday morning while Joel and Tamara were at her parents' place for the afternoon. He was done in under an hour. I tested the lock twice, put both keys in my cardigan pocket, and said nothing to anyone. Monday morning, Tamara tried the handle. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with her forehead creased. "Lorena, there's a new lock on the study door." "Yes," I said, pouring my tea. "Did you have that put in?" I did. She stared at me. We were going to use that room for Bridget. I turned to face her fully. Tamara, I told you I needed to think about it. I've thought about it. The answer is no. The study is mine, and it will remain mine. Bridget and Craig are welcome to look at Airbnbs near the Sleeman Center. There are usually good options, and I'm happy to help you search if you'd like. Tamara's jaw tightened. You can't just, this is completely unreasonable. She's family. She is your family, I said quietly. I am Joel's family. This is my house. Those two things have been confused for a while now. I'm simply clarifying them. She walked out and was on the phone to Joel within 30 seconds. Joel came home at lunch. He sat across from me at the dining room table. The dining room table his wife had been using as an office for 3 months, and he tried once more. Tamara was upset. Bridget had already bought her ticket. This was making things very difficult in their marriage. I placed the 2 documents I had prepared on the table between us. He picked up the formal notice to vacate and read it slowly. I watched something shift in his face. He set it down. Mum! I know, I said. You're actually doing this. I am reclaiming my home, yes. He sat with that for a moment in a different kind of quiet, not his usual avoidance, but the quiet of someone finally letting something land. I told her 3 months ago that the living room wasn't ours to take over, he said, his voice low. She said you hadn't objected, so it was fine. I objected every time, I told him, to both of you. He nodded slowly. He picked up the second document, the property title confirmation I'd printed from the county records, and set it back down without reading it. He knew the house was mine. He had known the whole time. He had simply been choosing not to let that knowledge require anything of him. The door code will be deactivated at the end of the notice period, I said. I would suggest you and Tamara begin looking for an apartment or a short-term rental this week. The market is tight, but there are units available. He left for the office without eating. I made myself a sandwich and stood in the kitchen, looking out at the back garden. The week before Bridget and Craig were due to arrive had the particular quality of water just before it reaches the boil. Everything still on the surface. Everything coiled underneath. Tamara moved through the house with appointed efficiency, keeping her conversations with me minimal, making calls to her sister in the hallway in a tone that suggested everything was entirely sorted. She had ordered throw pillows from a home goods website. I could only assume she meant them for the guest room, the one that already had a bed in it, the one I had not locked. On the Thursday before Bridget's arrival, I gathered my most personal things from the shared spaces. My mother's letters from the living room shelf, the framed photograph of Ken and me at Algonquin Park, the glass bowl his mother had given us at our wedding, and brought them into the study. I locked the door behind me and said nothing about it. Bridget and Craig were arriving Saturday by train from Toronto Union. I learned this from Tamara's phone calls, not from any direct conversation between us. Friday night, I quietly deactivated Tamara's access code on the front door keypad. I left Joel's active for one more day. I did not announce this, I simply did it. Saturday morning came gray and cold, the kind of November day that moves in off the lake and makes you glad for a warm house. I got up at 7, made coffee, and sat in my reading chair, moved back to its proper place in the living room 2 days earlier, the way it had always been. I had the new biography of Lester B. Pearson I'd been meaning to start for months. I opened it at the beginning. Just after 11, Joel came in through the front door. He came into the living room, looked at me reading, looked at the clock, and sat down in the armchair without speaking. He had the look of a man who had stopped pretending. At 12:20, a car pulled up outside. Tamara had gone to collect Bridget and Craig from the Guelph Central Station. I heard them come up the front walk, rolling luggage on the porch steps. Tamara's voice, warm and hostess bright. Then I heard the sound of her code being entered into the keypad. A pause. Entered again. Joel looked up from his phone. He looked at me. I turned a page. The doorbell rang. Joel stood and went to answer it. I stayed in my chair. I heard Tamara's voice drop from bright to tight. I heard Craig's voice, calm, Maybe just ring the bell. And Bridget, who sounded tired from the journey, "It's fine, we'll sort it out." Joel opened the door. He stepped aside to let them into the front hall, which was as far as they got, because I had come to stand in the doorway between the hall and the living room. "Lorena," Tamara said, her voice carrying a warning edge. "This is my sister Bridget and her husband Craig. They're going to be staying in the study. I've already been arranging things." I looked directly at Bridget and smiled in the way I would smile at anyone who had arrived in an unfamiliar situation through no fault of their own. "Welcome to Guelph," I said. "I hope the train from Toronto wasn't too slow. The November schedule can drag." Bridget smiled back, uncertain. Craig nodded. He was already reading the room with the particular awareness of a sensible person who has walked into something that doesn't quite add up. Tamara moved past me toward the study door at the end of the hall. She reached for the handle. It didn't turn. She tried again. She looked at the deadbolt, the new hardware, and turned to face me with an expression that had moved entirely past frustration. "Open this door," she said. "That room is my personal study," I said, keeping my voice even and low. "It has always been my personal study. I have the only key." "You said you'd think about it." "I did think about it. This is the result." Tamara turned to Joel. "Tell your mother to open that door. Bridget and Craig have nowhere else to go. We arranged this weeks ago." Joel stood with his hands at his sides. He looked at Tamara. He looked at me. He looked at the locked door. And then, quietly, he lifted his head and looked at his wife directly. "She told us no," he said. "She told both of us no, more than once, and I didn't stand behind her the way I should have. That's on me." He paused. "But Lorena owns this house. I've always known that. I just kept acting like it didn't have to mean anything." Tamara stared at him. The silence that landed after that had real weight. Craig put his hand on Bridget's arm, gently but with purpose. "I'll pull up hotels," he said to his wife, already reaching for his phone. He said it quietly, like a man who had learned not to escalate things in other people's homes. Bridget looked visibly relieved. She said something soft to Craig, and he stepped toward the front door. Tamara stood in my front hallway for a long moment, looking at the locked door, at Joel, and finally at me. The expression on her face was not pleasant, but I had not asked for pleasant. I had asked for what was mine. "Your things are in the guest room," I told her, as calmly as I was able. "I moved them there earlier this week. The guest room is available to the two of you for the remainder of the notice period. Craig, there should be a good Airbnb near the Sleeman Center if you'd like a recommendation. Or the Delta downtown has decent rates this time of year." Within the hour, Bridget and Craig had reloaded their bags into the car and headed toward an Airbnb Craig had found near the river. Tamara followed them out without looking at me. Joel stayed behind in the front hall. "I should have said something the day she moved your chair," he said. He was looking at the deadbolt. "Before that even." "When she did the kitchen." "Yes," I said, "you should have." He nodded. He put on his coat and went out to help Tamara carry the rest of their things to the car. I walked down the hall, unlocked the study door, and went inside. The November light was thin and flat across the back garden. The mums were well past their season now. I could see where the beds would be in the spring. The ones I would plant properly, the way I had always intended, when the house was quiet and mine again. I made a cup of tea and sat at Ken's oak desk and held it with both hands until the warmth came through. 3 weeks later, Joel pulled into the driveway on a Saturday afternoon. He came alone. He rang the front doorbell, instead of entering a code which communicated more than most things he could have said. I let him in and we sat in the living room. My reading chair in its proper place. The Pearson biography finished on the side table. My mother's letters back on the shelf where they belonged. He told me that he and Tamara had signed a short-term lease on an apartment off Edinburgh Road, about 3 kilometers away. He told me they were seeing a therapist together, something Tamara had agreed to after a long conversation with her own mother that had apparently followed quickly. After the afternoon, they all stood in my hallway with the locked door. Bridget's husband Craig told her what he'd seen, Joel said, looking at his hands. how things had developed here. Tamara's mother wasn't easy about it. No, I said, I imagined she wouldn't be. She asked Tamara whether she would have done any of that in someone else's home, a stranger's home. He paused. Tamara didn't have an answer. Joel looked up at me. I should have protected you in this. From the beginning, I kept telling myself it was temporary, that things would sort themselves out, that the conflict wasn't worth it. I was wrong about all of that, and I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry, Mom. I have worked with numbers long enough to know that they either balance or they don't. There is no partial credit, no approximation that passes for the real figure. But families are not ledgers. My son was sitting in front of me doing the hard thing, not smoothing it over, not minimizing it into something easier to hold, but actually saying the words and meaning them. You are always my son, I told him. Nothing that happened changes that. What you and Tamara work through together, that is your work to do. But when you come to this house, you come as my guest, on my terms. And if Tamara comes with you, the same applies to her. He nodded. He stayed for an hour. We talked about other things. The new build permit had finally come through, and the concrete work was starting in January. He'd gone back to swimming on Saturday mornings, something he'd let slide during the stress of the past months. When he left, he hugged me at the door, and I held on a moment longer than I usually do. After his car turned the corner at the end of Pemberton Crescent, I locked the front door, walked down the hall, and opened my study. Everything was exactly where I had left it. My mother's journals on the middle shelf, the glass bowl on the corner of the desk where it had always sat, Ken's oak desk catching the last of the afternoon light in the same warm stain he'd chosen that long ago winter. Outside, the November wind moved through the cedars along the back fence, the same cedars that had been there when Ken and I first put in the garden, before the diagnoses, before the loss, before all the years that teach you, slowly, what belongs to you and what you must not surrender. I sat down at the desk, opened a blank notebook, and wrote the date at the top of the first page. Some chapters end quietly. This one had ended with a deadbolt and a clear afternoon, and the particular satisfaction of a house returned to the woman who had earned every room of it, one careful, honest year at a time.